We're so glad you tuned in for another episode of The Catholic View for Women here on EWTN. I'm Teresa Tomeo, along with Elena Rodriguez, of course, and Janet Morana, and I'm really excited about this program because I had Anthony DeStefano from Priest Your Life, a well-known best-selling Catholic author and frequent guest here on EWTN television and radio, on my show twice recently on his brand new book on atheism. It's such a good book. We were talking, ladies, in the last episode about this whole attitude of me, myself, and I, and where it leads, how dangerous it leads, in terms of what the church is seeing in the new Gnosticism and new Neo-Pelagianism, how we push God out of everything, and it's all about us. We disregard the body, do whatever we want with the body. Salvation is from our own understanding of it without any influence from any outside sources. Eventually, this kind of thinking, and Anthony and I discussed this on my show, can lead to the atheist mind.
That's right. And of course, his book is called Inside the Atheist Mind.
Right.
And of course, you know, Teresa and I chatted with him and said, okay, we're going to give you a rare opportunity to be on our show.
Right.
So we gave him some questions and we asked him to, you know, send us a clip. So why don't we take a look at the famous author, Anthony DeStefano, and see what he had to say about Inside the Atheist Mind.
Hi, ladies. Thanks for allowing me to talk about this very important subject for a few minutes. Yes, we need to be concerned about atheism for the simple reason that it's reaching epidemic proportions in our culture. All the surveys show that the West is going to lose its Christian majority very soon to those who consider themselves atheists or religiously unaffiliated. In fact, the religiously unaffiliated, or nuns as they're sometimes called, make up almost a quarter of the population in the United States. And as we know, this kind of thinking is very trendy and very popular with today's youth. Young people seem to be attracted by the confident, firebrand styles of atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. And of course, many of them like the idea of a hedonistic culture with no moral imperatives or commandments. In fact, the truth is, the statistics about atheists today actually underestimate their impact on the culture. We know that many Christians today stop short of calling themselves atheists, but at the same time reject the majority of doctrines held by the church. In other words, their professed religious views have little or no relevance in their lives. For all practical purposes, they're atheists. The bottom line is, we're literally facing a crisis of faith right now. And the first thing I think we have to do is wake up to all this. Too many Christians today are sleeping. They live a very comfortable Christianity. They just don't realize that there's a spiritual war being waged right now. All our deepest beliefs and values are under attack. We're under attack. And in many ways, I think we're losing. So with all due respect, I think the time for being nice and amiable is done. We have to engage those who are opposing us in a very bold, very aggressive, and very fearless way. We have to recognize atheism for what it is, an intellectually bankrupt religion. Yes, it's a religion. It's a religion that has its own philosophy, materialism, its own morality, relativism, its own politics, social Darwinism, its own culture, secularism. It even has its own sacraments, abortion and euthanasia. And this system of beliefs has been responsible for more death, carnage, and persecution than any system of beliefs the world has ever known. In the last 100 years alone, atheist governments led by people like Stalin and Mao Zedong and Hitler and Pol Pot have killed over 150 million people. 150 million. We need to know these facts. And at the same time, we have to be ready to point out that the greatest intellectual achievements in history have been made by believers, not atheists. Just look at the list of scientists, artists, writers, and philosophers of the past who believed fervently in God. It's a truly staggering list. The Big Bang Theory, for example, was formulated by a Roman Catholic priest. The father of genetics was an Augustinian monk. Atheists, and most believers, are completely ignorant of all this. I say it's time we went on the offense. We need to point out that the atheists are driving this frightening culture of death we're engulfed in, a culture in which 30 million abortions take place every single year, and the use of euthanasia and assisted suicide is becoming routine across the globe. You know, in some parts of the world, people are being euthanized now for having dementia and alcoholism. It's very scary. In the end, atheism is a belief system without hope. Atheists themselves are nihilistic and negative, and for the most part, miserably unhappy human beings. If they left us alone, it would be one thing. But unfortunately, like all negative and unhappy people, they want everybody else to be as unhappy as they are. Well, we can't allow that. We can't sit back and be punching bags for these obnoxious bullies any longer. Enough is enough. No more turning the other cheek. And let me say one final thing about this point. People misinterpret that Bible verse about turning the other cheek all the time. All our Lord meant was that, insofar as possible, we shouldn't take grievances personally and shouldn't respond out of pride. We shouldn't make everything about our own wounded pride. Whenever possible, we should turn our cheek. But we never have the right to turn other people's cheeks. On the contrary, we have a God-given obligation to defend and love our neighbors. We have an obligation to fight against injustice and oppression of every kind. The proof of this is that Jesus himself didn't turn the other cheek. When he saw how the money changers in the temple were cheating his people, he didn't turn the other cheek and walk away. Instead, he made a whip of cords and physically drove them out of the marketplace. And when the Pharisees and the scribes tried to trip him up with their clever word games, he put them in their place, calling them whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones and a brood of vipers. Our Lord fought back. And that's exactly what he wants us to do in response to today's arrogant, ignorant, intolerant, pseudo-intellectual, atheist know-nothings. We have to fight back, and we have to fight back now.
What I think is so important is that in his response to our questions that we sent him, Janet, it's going back to what we talked about in some of our earlier shows about the importance of not being afraid to stand up for your faith. Remember this show we had with Jim Caviezel, his beautiful talk that he gave to the Fellowship of Catholic University students at their convention, where he says, you know, we were made to stand out. And the coach of Michigan football, Jim Harbaugh, always says, I want my players to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. But not enough of us, as Anthony said, are willing to stand up for our faith, and we've allowed these radical atheists to really push themselves on us, on the culture, and as he said, it's getting worse.
It is. And, you know, of course, Anthony, like myself, you know, we grew up in New York, and we actually both grew up in Brooklyn, and then both made our journey to Staten Island, where we met Father Frank. But in New York, it's a real strange mixture. Like at Christmas time, there's a big atheist group that puts up billboards. About.
We saw one when we were there together, remember?
Right.
Yeah.
And they're basically saying that there is no God and what you're doing is, you know, ridiculous. It's almost mocking Christmas, you know. But then you have the other extreme. The Radio City Music Hall show still has the nativity scene in it.
Which is
Thanks
beautiful.
be to God, which is beautiful. You know, and so...
And the 12 Days of Christmas song.
That's right.
And they read One Solitary Life, and they have all the animals coming in.
That's right.
One Solitary
Life.
You know,
so in New York, I think, especially, we have both camps. We have the atheists trying to drum us out, and then we have the Christians trying to stand up and say, no, 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 we won't. And that's, I think, the point Anthony is making is there's this real subtleness, but it's really happening all over our country. When you think back, you know, when I grew up, prayer was in the schools, and one woman, it took one atheistic woman to take prayer out of schools. And then from prayer went out came the Bibles. You know, that they had it come out of the schools too. I mean, it sometimes just takes one strong atheist to squash us down. And so what Anthony's saying is, hey, it's getting worse and worse. You know, with everything, with some of the decisions that have gone up to the Supreme Court, there's been groups having to fight for the right to put a big giant cross up on their property. There were people that, I think it was one in Texas and one in California, where they were telling them, you have to take that cross down. So the atheists, like, you know, Anthony was, you know, he's very feisty, Anthony, to say that they're pushing hard at us. They are. They're not afraid to take us to court, get rid of your crosses and you know, and everything else. So we can't be afraid to speak up, really.
And it's very important not to be afraid. I have seen, and this is the popular outside world secular conception of Christians, that it's okay to insult Christians because by their beliefs, they can't fight back. They have to put the cheek.
Turn the other cheek.
Turn the other cheek. And I have actually
That's why I liked his
this.
explanation of what Jesus meant by turn the other cheek.
That's very important.
That was really important.
I have seen this in network newsrooms, in network newsrooms in New York City, where they have gone to do a stand-up with a church behind and speak ill of the church, and it has nothing to do with that parish. And this is a problem in journalism, because you're involving in the news that you are supposedly reporting, if it is true, you're involving this parish, and that's a right you cannot infringe. But they don't, and I actually brought up that point because I was there, and this network reporter, who is very famous, said, "Oh, that's okay, they'll never fight back." I mean, just like that, and he brushed it off. And I go like, no, wait a minute, but here's the problem. Anyways, so it is a widespread belief that in the secular world that we cannot fight back.
Well, but a lot of us have accepted that over the years, that we can't or shouldn't. We just have to pray for that person. Well, obviously, we take everything to the Lord in prayer. Of course, you have to, before you do any decision, anything, especially to fight back in the culture, you really need to cover yourself in prayer. But prayer is the start of it. We don't just sit back and allow these people to run ramshot, because as Anthony said, we have, and this is why, part of the reason we're in this situation today. I mean, look at the HHS mandate, the Health and Human Services mandate that was shoved down our throats from the previous administration, and how finally so many people stood up and said, no, enough is enough, and we were able to eventually get rid of it. But that mandate forcing, and really it was, if you think about it, an atheistic mandate, forcing religious organizations, entities, and groups like yours, and EWTN, we're all in court over this, to pay for things that
abortion
are totally
and
objectionable in their faith and their insurance programs. And this is what this kind of mindset leads to inside the atheist mind. It is all about doing what they want. They're their own gods, as we were talking about in the previous show. Right?
And that's what I said. There's been, every year there are cases that come before the Supreme Court on and on again where Christians are being attacked. I mean, at this taping, we haven't heard the outcome, but we have the baker that you know, did not want to make the cake for. He's a Christian, and he stood to it. Thank God, he stood to his principle. I'm not going to make that cake for the gay wedding. I mean, every year it's case after case, and some of them don't make them all the way to the Supreme Court because they only take a small percentage. But even in the lower courts, we are being attacked, and people have to really wake up. You know,
I think it goes back to, again, pride, and it goes back to being a pride and fear, because if you acknowledge God, then you have to start changing your life. If you acknowledge that he exists and that he is real and that Jesus really died for our sins, that requires a response and responsibility. And so if they can push out God, I always think of the word ego as an acronym, easing God out. If they can push God out, then they don't have to answer to anybody. But I also find it, and this was what Anthony and I discussed on the show, because and we can pick up after the break, Janet, because you said you had a couple of stories about Atheists for Life that march, and I've seen the signs when I'm covering the March for Life.
Yes, very clearly.
But I really think it is very hard to be an atheist. I mean, seriously, how can you, in all common sense, look out at the world, as beautiful as it is, even look at your hand and all the detail, or look out at your little backyard and see all the different plants and the flowers.
Especially in springtime.
In the springtime, and think that this all is happenstance.
Right.
You know, I mean, isn't it the Old Testament? I'm trying to remember, is it Proverbs said the foolish man does not believe in God, and then the fear of wisdom is the beginning of, you know, fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So, I mean, I don't believe that a lot of these atheists are really atheists. I just think they don't want to acknowledge that God exists. Yeah. We have to take a break. More on this topic, Inside the Atheist Mind, based on the best-selling book by our friend, author, speaker, Anthony DeStefano. We'll be right back. Welcome back to this episode of The Catholic View for Women. Teresa Tomeo, Elena Rodriguez, and Janet Morana talking about Inside the Atheist Mind. This discussion based on Anthony DeStefano's best-selling book by the same name. And Janet, you and I and Elena were talking before the break about the groups that are showing up now at the March for Life. And I've seen the banners the last few years, Atheists for Life.
Right. And then there's another group called Secular Pro-Life. And of course, you know, Father Pavone and I, we interact with all the pro-life leaders. In fact, we have a meeting that we pull everyone together 4 times a year, where the leaders come together and they get updates and all that. And the Atheists for Life and the secular pro-life, they attend these meetings. And the funny story is that the meetings have just been, we used to meet in a hotel in Washington, D.C., and the expense kept driving up. So now we meet at the Museum of the Bible. So
I love the way God works. Hello.
And if you've ever been to the Museum of the Bible, it's beautiful and magnificent.
I haven't been able to get there yet. I really want to go.
One of the things they did in creating it is you go through these giant bronze doors as you enter. And when you enter, all the marble tile is like black, like the carpet here on our set. And as you go into the museum a little bit further, some more white tiles appear and some more white tiles appear, so that when you get into the part where you're looking at the scriptures, it's all white tiles, you know? So it's to show that you're coming from the darkness out there in the secular world, that darkness into the light. Wow. So it's very dramatic. So I get amused that now the atheists are marching in to go to the meeting, and they literally have to go through this whole thing, take the elevator up and pass all these beautiful religious symbols and everything to get to the meeting. But I've spoken to them, and they say they're pro-life. And I said, okay, but you know, I understand we're trying to fight this issue that, you know, it's not just a God issue, but how do you see this? And they say, well, it's a human rights issue, and the unborn child has a right to exist from the moment of conception until natural death. And I went, that sounds like our religion.
Yeah, right.
You know, and I said, okay. So, you know, and then some people, I think, when they first started coming to our meetings, were very apprehensive, like, oh, we're letting these atheists in? And so Father Pavone said, look, we'll let someone in who worships the man in the moon if they want to stop baby killing. And then he said, and once we get rid of the baby killing, he goes, then we'll have a theological discussion why worshiping the man in the moon is a bad idea.
That's
and the same thing with the atheists.
We are very welcoming. We are very welcoming, and we want to share our ideas with them as well in a respectful inner dialogue.
Yeah, but I think there's a broad spectrum of people who claim to be, like Anthony was pointing out, you know, some people just say they won't affiliate to any religion, and we're finding this out more and more in the polls, especially when it comes to elections. You know, when
we mentioned the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right?
The nuns, you know, no religion, nuns, and from nuns, then you get people who are in more of a nun, I guess, when they say they're atheists, you know, I've even had friends over the years who, you know, said they were atheists, raised Catholic, and said, oh no, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God anymore. I said, okay. I said, but yet they do Easter baskets and bunnies, right?
And they celebrate Christmas.
And they celebrate Christmas. And I say to them, I said, well, okay, so you're not calling it Easter. What do you call it? Oh, it's Happy Spring. Happy Spring? Ah, okay, all right. And then at Christmas time, it's just
winter solstice?
Yes. And
please.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, it's like, yeah. But what Anthony's referring to is the real pushback from the real hardcore atheists. You know, there's, like I said, the others, I call them the mushy middle atheists, like they're not quite.
Yeah, because I don't really think, because we've discussed this on my radio show with Anthony, and I said, Anthony, the people who are recognizing life and who aren't so hardcore, I really don't think deep down they're atheists. There's something that's clicked in their minds.
Right.
That it's not all about them and it's beyond. You cannot look at the human person, just starting with the human person, and think that everything happened, just happened. We're just a bunch of atoms floating around. You know? And you should not have any affinity for anybody else but yourself if you're an atheist, because it doesn't matter. And if we talked about this in my program also, if you're married, that means you love someone, and there's that sacrificial love of husband and wife. If you have children, there's that sacrificial love. What is your true north? Where does that love come from? It comes from God.
Right.
So it's like they're not really atheists. I really think, as we said, we're discussing before the break, that they are afraid to let God in because they have to submit their will, and they know they have to change, and they have to live an accountable life.
Well, I also think that some people are pushing God away because of maybe things that have happened in their lives.
Yeah, they're fearful, or they're angry,
or
they're hurt.
Angry. Maybe if people in their family have died, especially if they've lost a child at a young age, or a parent at a young age. Why me? God wasn't here, so I'm pushing God out of my life.
But did they recognize God when good things happened in their life? Because I know when I came back to the church, And when I lost my first of many come to Jesus moments is when I lost my big important TV news job as an anchor and a reporter. And I had no relationship with God, but I blamed him for everything in my life that was wrong. And yet when things were going great, I never really thanked him for it. And all of a sudden it was all his fault that I didn't have a relationship with him. So I think, I get that way of thinking, but it's not a very coherent way of thinking, because you can't blame God if you don't have. We shouldn't blame God in the first place, because he doesn't go out zapping people. That's not the way our faith works. But really, you need to give God a chance again. So if you have people in your family, or maybe you're struggling with that right now, I would really highly recommend Anthony's book, but also to think, if you claim you're an atheist, how do you love someone? What about art? What about poetry? What about beauty in the world? Where does that all come from? And why should you care if you're truly an atheist?
That's true. It's true. But I still get amused by
I'm glad they're there. I'm glad they're there, and we're
having the conversations with them, and and they all know, where me and Father Frank and all the other Christians that are in the pro-life movement, are with religion. And it's funny too, because we always start our meeting with a prayer. And they're there. At least they're tolerant atheists. They tolerate our praying. Yeah. But what Anthony is referring to is really the kinds that we see in New York a lot, and in big cities like in LA, out where my daughter is. Like, talk about a real atheistic culture out in Hollywood and things like that. I think those are that's the people that we have to be not afraid to push back at.
And that is very important. We have to be very aware of what is our mission in this world as baptized Christians. And think of the salmon. What do the salmon do?
Swim upstream.
They swim upstream, so it's effort. It's against nature. It's their nature to go against nature, in the sense that they're swimming upstream. It's difficult. But they do it. Why? Because they have a purpose. They have to swim upstream so they can procreate, and they can lay their eggs, and there can be more little salmon. And they have to stick their head out of the water. Not only their head, they have to stick their jump out of the water completely. What happens when they jump out of the water? They can get snatched by a bear, but they still do it. And some of them even give up their lives, but the rest of them keep swimming up until they fulfill their purpose. So very much so, our life, Christian life, is always swimming upstream. We can't say, because I'm Christian, now everything's going to be very easy. Oh no, everything is going to be very difficult, but you're going to have the grace of God, where before you didn't have it.
I wouldn't say everything's going to be difficult. I think we have a bigger target on our back when we accept Christ and we get involved. But we're not meant to have a life of all suffering. God gives us the abundant life, John 10:10. Now, is there going to be suffering? Yes. And hard,
we're going to enjoy the good moments better.
But the difference is, when you're a Christian, and especially a Catholic Christian, you learn from that suffering. We have a whole theology of suffering.
And redemptive suffering.
But I think there's sometimes, and I know what you meant by that statement, because rain falls on the just and the unjust, as it says in Scripture. But I don't want people to think that by really recommitting your life to Christ, you're just going to be miserable all the time, because I've never had more fun in my life since I came back to the church. Anyway, we're talking too much. Time for homework. Go ahead.
For homework. Teacher. Well, the first is really read Inside the Atheist Mind by Anthony DeStefano. It's available at the EWTN Religious Catalog. Great book. That's EWTNRC.com. Number 2 is listen to Catholic Answers live radio show to ask and learn about your faith, and that's Catholic.com.
And they sometimes have shows specifically for atheists
to
call in.
To call in questions.
Yes.
And of course, like Mother Angelica always said, keep the holy reminders around the house. Have your atheistic friends over, have plenty of things on display. And of course, our patrons for the show, the Kitchen Madonna, available at the EWTN Religious Catalog. And of course, we want to remind everyone to go to our website, thecatholicviewforwomen.com, for more information. We have all the links from even our other shows of documents you can read. Our past shows are up there on the internet. Watch them and get your friends to watch them and really study. And finally, don't be obsessed with it, but like us on Facebook and follow us there too.
Spread the news about the Catholic View for Women, Anthony's great book, and all of our other great resources. And we're so glad you tuned in, and we will see you next time. On behalf of Janet Morana, Elena Rodriguez, I'm Teresa Tomeo, the Catholic View for Women. Ciao, ciao.